The studio lights blazed, the crowd roared, and Jimmy Kimmel was ready to throw punches. But no one expected Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, to walk onto that stage so calm, so composed, and so ready to fire back. Dressed sharp and sitting tall, Karoline barely blinked when Kimmel opened with a jab straight at Trump's marriage, clearly aiming to rattle her. But what happened next? It wasn't just a response. It was a mic drop moment that left the audience stunned. Before we jump in, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next political showdown mainstream media won't dare to cover. Let's get started with the city buzz beneath the twilight sky. The bright signs of Hollywood Boulevard flickered to life, bathing the sidewalk in electric hues of red and blue. Inside the theater, the familiar hum of production surrounded the air. Stagehands checked microphones, camera angles were prepped, and the cue cards were loaded. This wasn't just another night on Jimmy Kimmel Live. This was a planned spectacle. The audience shuffled into their seats with coffees in hand and laughter already brewing in their throats. They didn't know exactly what they'd hear tonight, but they knew what to expect. Sharp jabs, playful humiliation, a touch of political venom, all the trademarks of a show meant to entertain at someone else's expense. 30 seconds to go, a stagehand whispered. Behind the curtain, Karoline Leavitt waited in silence. She stood in a hallway flanked by assistants with earpieces, her breath steady but controlled, her expression calm but calculating. She had been in more high-pressure rooms than most people twice her age. Cabinet briefings, press ambushes, campaign firestorms. But tonight wasn't about policy. It was about performance. She smoothed the fabric of her fitted navy dress, adjusted the cuff of her jacket, and stared at her reflection in the monitor. "They don't want your voice," she whispered to herself. "They want a reaction." A studio assistant leaned over. "You're on in 20 seconds, Miss Leavitt." She nodded. The intro theme blasted across the room as the applause sign lit up. The crowd erupted, hands clapping like thunder. Jimmy Kimmel walked out with exaggerated swagger, the lights casting a sheen across his brow. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's going to be wild," he said with a grin, "because tonight we have the one and only Karoline Leavitt." The room erupted again, some clapping sincerely, others with a tinge of smug delight. A few jeered just loud enough to be heard, expecting a political firestorm disguised as a talk show. Karoline stepped out. Her stride was smooth, not stiff. Her chin was slightly raised, eyes scanning the crowd just once before locking onto Jimmy. Her smile was polite, thin, respectful, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She took her seat, crossed one leg over the other, and folded her hands in her lap. The audience quieted. Jimmy, already grinning from ear to ear, leaned into the desk. "So, Karoline," he began, "before we get into all the saving America stuff, I've got to ask, has Trump tweeted anything about me in the last hour? I mean, last time he was up at 3 a.m. talking about how my jokes were horribly unfunny, which is funny coming from a guy who sent Melania a cheeseburger instead of roses for their anniversary." Laughter erupted, louder than before. Karoline's expression didn't shift, but the muscles behind her jaw tensed just slightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jimmy, unfazed. "You should stick to comedy, Jimmy," she replied, her voice even. "Because your political commentary? That's as fake as your ratings." The audience chuckled, some nervously, others boldly. Jimmy raised an eyebrow, pretending to be wounded. "Ouch! Fake ratings? That hurts, almost as much as Trump forgetting to say, 'Happy anniversary,' and handing his wife a quarter-pounder with a side of tariffs." Another round of laughter, but Karoline could feel the air changing. The lines weren't just jokes, they were bullets. Carefully crafted, personally aimed. And she wasn't surprised. She was prepared. "Jimmy," she said calmly, You don't know the first thing about what it takes to hold a marriage together under pressure or to lead under fire, but you sure know how to make cheap shots in a climate-controlled studio. There were a few scattered claps, brief, cautious, like someone testing ice. Jimmy grinned again. Fair enough, but I have to ask, who did send the burger? You or Trump? The audience roared again, but Karoline didn't smile. She blinked once and made a mental note. They don't want truth. They want theater. What Jimmy didn't know was that she'd faced ridicule before, not in late-night studios, but in classrooms as a young conservative, in newsrooms where she was the only woman defending her beliefs, in hospitals where she was recovering from childbirth and checking campaign updates, in White House corridors echoing with tension. So no, this wasn't new, but it was personal. The jokes escalated, one after another, a laugh track of personal digs, claps, whistles. So Karoline, Jimmy said casually, I hear Trump's new tariffs are called Liberation Day. Makes sense since Melania just liberated herself from the West Wing. Laughter thundered. Seriously though, Jimmy continued, you call this economic policy? Sending McDonald's and meme tweets? Maybe that's the Trump doctrine. Let them eat Big Macs. The crowd howled. Someone shouted, say it louder, Jimmy. Karoline clenched her fists under the table. A camera caught it. The producer saw it. Jimmy saw it. And he pressed harder. So are you here to defend Trump's foreign policy or to deliver his next burger order? That one hit, not because of the words, but because of the tone, the crowd's reaction, the smugness in every syllable, the implication that her work, her sacrifice, was worth no more than a fry cook's errand, that her loyalty was servitude. Karoline sat up straighter, her fingers uncurled, her posture lengthened, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer measured. It was cold, precise. Jimmy, she said, her eyes like steel, do you really think mocking someone's marriage, someone's family, is how you serve America? The laughter cracked. The tension snapped taut. A few people stopped clapping, because even they, some loyal to Jimmy's brand of satire, knew that line had cut too deep. Karoline leaned in. You don't know what it's like to wake up at 3 a.m. because the press is hounding your team over a lie, or to hold your son after delivery while reading political attacks on your phone. You don't know sacrifice. You know punchlines. There was no applause, no laughter, just stillness, because in that moment the crowd realized she wasn't playing. Jimmy blinked, visibly recalibrating. He wasn't used to pushback that felt real. Well, hey, I'm not attacking your motherhood, he said, voice softening just a hair. I just think we all need a laugh. At what cost? Karoline fired back. At the cost of truth? Of someone's marriage? Their family? She took a breath. The man I work for, yes, Donald Trump, isn't perfect, but he doesn't deserve to have his personal life shredded because you need ratings. A murmur ran through the room. One older man in the third row, a veteran judging by the lapel pin, nodded quietly. You know something, Miss Leavitt, he whispered. That's right. The cameras didn't catch it, but Karoline heard it. And it was enough, because now she wasn't defending herself anymore. She was defending every person in America who'd been ridiculed for choosing tradition over trend, who stayed loyal to their spouse, their country, their faith, even when the world called them old-fashioned, foolish, or laughable. Karoline sat back, uncrossing her legs. She didn't need to raise her voice, because when truth is spoken from pain, it doesn't need volume. It needs courage. If standing with my president means being mocked by you, Jimmy, I'll take that trade every day. Silence, then a single clap, then 3, then 10, then half the studio. The other half stayed frozen, not because they disagreed, but because they had no response. Would you like me to continue expanding parts 3 and 4 next? Building into the crowd's emotional shift and Karoline's defining rebuttal moment? Or should we pause here so you can review this first half of the expansion? Let me know how you'd like to proceed. The tension that lingered after Karoline's last words was more than awkward. It was confrontational. A moment not built on applause or performance, but on clarity, on conviction. Jimmy's signature grin faded just slightly. He leaned back in his chair as if the temperature on stage had risen. "Wow," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "You know, Karoline, I've got to give it to you. You're loyal, fiercely loyal." The crowd responded with polite chuckles, unsure which way the wind was blowing now. Karoline didn't smile. "I'm loyal because I believe in something bigger than late-night comedy, Jimmy," she said firmly. "I'm loyal because I've seen firsthand what it means to lead when the whole world wants you to fall." Jimmy tilted his head. "You're saying Trump's a hero now?" "I'm saying he stood up when no one else would," she answered. "And I've stood beside him not because it's easy, but because it's right." A few people clapped, some out of agreement, others out of respect. Karoline took a breath. Then she rose. Not for applause, not for effect, but because the weight of silence demanded presence. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture wildly. She owned the space. "Let me tell you what you don't see from your desk, Jimmy. You don't see the steelworker who cried when his job came back. You don't see the military mom who got a call from the White House just to say, 'We haven't forgotten you.' You don't see the cancer patient who watched tariffs open the door for affordable treatment again." Now the crowd was dead silent. Karoline's eyes burned, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous to the status quo: righteousness. "You don't have to like the man," she continued, "but you can't deny the fight. You sit here tossing jokes about burgers and broken marriages. But do you know what it takes to wake up every day knowing the world's rooting for your failure?" She stepped forward. "Do you know what it takes to keep going?" Jimmy didn't speak. The audience didn't move. Karoline's voice dropped to a hush, barely above a whisper. "It takes love. Love of country, love of duty, and yes, love of family." A murmur swept through the room, one of awe, not mockery. This wasn't a PR-trained answer. It was a young woman's war cry dressed in velvet. Backstage, the producers whispered into headsets. "This isn't how we planned it. She's turning the room. Let her keep going. This is TV gold." But to Karoline, it wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. "Jimmy," she said again, her tone softening but firm, "you don't know me, and you clearly don't know President Trump, but you've made it your job to mock everything he's built, everything we fought for, and that's your right." She paused. "But I won't let you pretend it's righteous." A few elderly audience members, quiet up until now, began to clap. Not for the drama, not for the defiance, but for the dignity. For the first time that night, Jimmy didn't interrupt. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What started as a staged roast was now a stage of reckoning. Jimmy reached for his coffee mug, not because he needed a sip, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. Karoline stood, hands at her side, not fidgeting, not defensive, just steady. The kind of composure you only earn through fire. "Look," Jimmy finally said, "I get it. You've got heart. But come on, Karoline. Can't we laugh once in a while?" "Of course we can," she said. "Laughter is part of being human. But what you're doing isn't laughter. It's degradation, and you know it." She turned to the audience now. "Do you all feel better because we laughed at a marriage? At someone's pain?" Silence. Even the band had stopped playing background chords. She kept her eyes locked on the crowd. Senior veterans, younger interns, retired nurses, tired workers. And in their faces, she saw it. Conviction. "You know what doesn't make headlines, Jimmy?" she said, voice rising. "The Americans who still believe in something. The elderly couple living on Social Security who voted because they still have hope. The soldier's widow who still places a hand on the flag each morning. The teenager who stands for the anthem while everyone else sits." That's when something unexpected happened. A man in the fifth row, gray hair wearing a Navy veteran cap, stood up and clapped. Once, then again. And slowly, row by row, others followed. The applause wasn't frenzied, it was respectful, measured, earned. Karoline didn't smile, she just nodded. "I'm not here to entertain you," she said. "I'm here to remind you who we are, and who we're becoming if we keep laughing at the wrong things." Jimmy leaned forward, trying to claw back the room. "You think Trump never laughed? Come on, Karoline." "He laughs," she replied, "but not at America's pain, not at a woman's dignity, not at soldiers or welders or widows." She turned to him now, face to face. "Do you?" Jimmy opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence in the studio was deafening. Backstage, someone whispered, "Cut to commercial. Number, let it breathe." Because in that moment, the country was watching something rare. Moral clarity. Karoline sat back down. She crossed her arms, not in anger, but in peace. "If defending truth, family, and country makes me a fool on this show, I'll wear the title proudly." A few audience members rose to their feet. Applause swept through the room again, bigger this time. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, adjusting his collar. "Well, folks," he said, "looks like I brought a knife to a flag fight." Laughter broke, this time light-hearted, not mocking. Karoline smiled, just slightly, and for the first time all night, the crowd laughed with her, not at her. The lights above the studio glowed brighter than ever, but inside the room, it felt like dusk had settled. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward slowly, his expression noticeably subdued. The confidence, the cadence, the smirking sarcasm, they had dimmed. Karoline Leavitt, still seated but unshaken, exhaled softly, steadying herself. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't glowing. She was grounded, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Well," Jimmy muttered, finally breaking the silence. "Karoline, you came ready. I'll give you that." "No, Jimmy," she replied gently. "I came honest." The crowd was hushed again, waiting, not sure whether to laugh or listen. She glanced out over the studio, eyes scanning the faces, some still skeptical, some clearly swayed. But it was the older faces that held her gaze. The veterans, the retirees, the mothers in the back row who had nodded when she spoke of faith and duty. "I'm not here to be right," Karoline said, her voice lowering like a final hymn. "I'm here because someone has to say what many are too afraid to say in rooms like this." She stood again, this time with a calm grace, not confrontation. There was a time in this country when making fun of a man's marriage, of his wife, wasn't called comedy, it was called cruelty. A few in the audience shifted in their seats. A woman reached for a tissue. There was a time when public servants, those who gave up birthdays, holidays, even health, were honored, not mocked for fast food or midnight tweets. Her eyes narrowed. "You don't have to like President Trump. You don't have to agree with his policies. But if you can sit here and laugh while dragging a man's personal life, while belittling the very people he's trying to fight for, then the problem isn't him." She looked directly at Jimmy. "It's you." The words hit like stone across still water. Even Jimmy didn't try to interrupt. Karoline continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "My loyalty isn't to a party, it's to the truth. To the factory worker who just wants dignity. To the widow who wants to believe her husband's service meant something. To the single mom who wants to know that someone in Washington still hears her. She turned to the camera now, speaking not to Jimmy, but to America. And to every person watching this, whether you agree with me or not, I just want to say one thing. She paused, a breath. Don't let laughter drown out truth. Don't let mockery become your medicine. Because if we lose our ability to respect one another, even when we disagree, we lose this country. A tear welled in her right eye but didn't fall. I've seen what President Trump does when no one's watching. I've seen the phone calls to families who lost loved ones. I've watched him cry behind the scenes for children he couldn't save. And I've watched him get up the next morning to keep fighting anyway. She stepped back. So laugh all you want, but don't mistake jokes for judgment, because someday history won't remember the punchlines. It'll remember who stood up when it was easier to sit down. The studio erupted, not with jeers, but with applause. Strong, united, earned. Jimmy stood now, clapping slowly, trying to regain control of the moment. Well said, Karoline, he admitted, his voice tinged with something rare, respect. I still think a few burgers might be involved, but well said. Laughter, this time sincere, swept the room. Even Karoline chuckled softly. If he's feeding America and fighting for it, I say, let the man eat. More applause. The tension had lifted, not dissolved, but transformed. By the next morning, the confrontation was everywhere. Clips of Karoline's speech went viral, spliced between headlines, reactions, and slow-motion zooms on the moment she said, "It's you." On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag number Karoline Claps Back trended for 36 hours. On Facebook, veterans pages posted side-by-side quotes from Karoline and Reagan. On YouTube, commentators across the political spectrum asked the same question. Did Jimmy go too far, or did Karoline just expose something deeper? Even people who hadn't followed politics watched the segment, not for scandal, but because something about that moment felt like America again. Raw, unfiltered, earnest. Later that week, Karoline sat for an interview with a smaller conservative network. She wore a simple blouse, her hair in a low ponytail. No makeup crew. Why didn't you walk off the stage? The host asked. Karoline smiled softly. Because I wanted young women, especially ones who believe in faith and family, to see that you don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to sit down just because someone with a bigger microphone tells you to. You can speak quietly and still move mountains. If you have made it this far, please answer the following question for me. Do you believe mockery should be entertainment, or has the media gone too far? Comment below. Would you have stood up the way Karoline did? Share this video with someone who needs hope that dignity still exists in our public conversations. Subscribe for more stories where courage defeats noise and truth still has a voice. Because when one person stands tall in the storm, millions remember how.